This episode of Planted is brought to you by Pax Labs.
The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Planted with Sara Pine. I'm Sara Pine, your host, and today I have a very special guest. Bob Hoban's on the show. He has been an attorney in the cannabis space for almost 2 decades, doing international work, and he was also named one of the top power players in cannabis by Forbes. Bob, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here today.
No, Sarah, it's my pleasure. It's a big fan. Love what you're doing. Love the conversation you bring to the table, and happy to be a part of it.
I'm so well. We've been meaning to do this for a while, and we got to hang out in Iceland. So I was so excited because we're both we have our crazy schedules that we're able to make it happen and sit down, talk. Where are you today?
I'm in Colorado today, in Morrison, Colorado. So
you're home basing it today.
I am just around the corner from Red Rocks.
Nice. I know that place well. So first question I like to ask all my guests, what was your first cannabis experience?
It's a good question. I went to a Catholic school growing up, so we drank a lot of alcohol, furnished by parents. This was the norm, right? Cannabis, marijuana, pot, weed, whatever you want to call it, was kind of, that was a drug, still stigmatized, but very heavily stigmatized in that community in Southern New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, where I grew up. And I worked at a plant store called Frank's Nursery and Crafts, and met a couple friends there. And they asked me one weekend, I was probably a sophomore in high school, "You want to come to a party this Saturday night?" I go, yeah, sure, I'd love to. I didn't get to the party, but I go on Monday, and they say, "We missed you at the party. We were packing bowls all night long." And I said, "Packing bowls? What the heck do you mean packing bowls?" I was familiar with smoking a cannabis joint. I hadn't done it, but I understood that. So I started hanging out with these guys, and it became part of my life in many ways. So that would have been gonna date myself here, but probably 1990, 91.
Well, that's one of those times when we're really curious and we try different things. Kids don't try this at home, but I also feel like with the stigma around it too, for those of us that were a little more inquisitive, that, liked to learn and learn more about the world, almost like when you have stigma, it almost prompts you to be like, well, what's the big deal? Now I got to figure it out.
Exactly. And I was fortunate that I think we were both fortunate in the time that we grew up that, yes, there were prohibited things that we weren't supposed to do, marijuana, other drugs. It doesn't seem to be as bad as, sort of the pill culture that popped up over the last couple of decades. So we were able to avoid that. But yeah, that opened the door. That made it much more exciting. And I was a big fan right away. That first bowl. First of all, when he said packing bowls, I couldn't even imagine what he's talking about. What's a bowl? Like, are you taking a bowl, like a cereal bowl, and you're putting marijuana in it? What are you doing?
Right.
It was back in the day, right? A bowl, obviously we all know a bowl's a pipe. And, at the time it was the prototype. If you remember the old school prototype.
I do. And actually, the friends of mine, the Bohemian Chemist, just did a collab with them and brought it back. And it's really beautiful.
It's like a work of art. It is designed to be perfect in every way. And I just remember that. And I immediately went out and bought one. And I've seen them around a little bit these days, but not so much. Then I became a big fan of the one hitters, the old bat, that open it up, that the spring pops it out. Those were good, but then those, in this day and age, you can't really use a bat because cannabis is so good, it's so sticky and so resiny that those bats get caked up pretty quick. But yeah, that was sort of my introduction to cannabis, and and it was and still is a stigmatized world around it. But I think by doing a lot of what I've done and what our whole movement, what our whole industry has done over the last couple of decades has changed things. So we're here talking about it on a major stage.
Right. I love that because like I always like to say conversations normalization. And the more we talk about things, even though there is stigma, the less there is. I mean, even I notice now that young people these days, if they're like, I've talked to, younger people who are, I'm like, "Are cannabis, what are your thoughts?" And like, "Oh, my uncle smokes it, whatever."
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
it's kinda like how I used to look at 7 and 7s that my mom used to drink at, like, wedding receptions.
No, it's true. It's true. It's I have a son who's a junior in college, and yes, cannabis use. We're in Colorado and as well, so cannabis use is prevalent, but it is perceived as something that your parents do. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does seemingly help to normalize things because now I'll go drink a 7 and 7, which I wouldn't have drank in my 20s.
You rebel, you. No, I mean, I think you're right, and I think that, with that comes more thoughtful use because it's not about, "This is the moment, I don't know when it's gonna happen again, hush, hush, let's try it." It's kind of like, "Well, I'm curious about it, let me look into it and see if it's right for me." Because it's, like anything in life, like, cannabis is a very nuanced thing, and, like I always like to say when I was teaching my classes, we all create endogenous cannabinoids, but not all of us tolerate phytocannabinoids. And guess what? It's okay. And that goes for a
Mhm.
lot of things in life. Like, I my favorite saying these days is I'm not gonna yuck anyone else's yum. Like it might not be for me, but that doesn't mean that I'm not gonna allow it to happen as long as it's not hurting anybody. I think that's the biggest thing. And, a lot of the work that you've been doing around policy is a big part of setting the stage for, those safe containers for experimentation and conversations to create policy that not only, you know, addresses public safety, but also helps create a more robust industry that serves the people that it's intended for, which are grown-ups. And that being said, how did you get into cannabis? Like when you went to law school, were you like, I want to dive into this too, or was there a different pathway? Because we all have these weird stories of how we get into it. Nobody ever thinks, well, maybe they do now, but when we were kids, nobody was like, I'm going to work in weed.
No, true, true, and especially as an attorney, right? Um, the if you were an attorney, if you were in law school back in the day, you wanted to be in cannabis. You were a criminal defense attorney, right? That was your pathway. I never really wanted to be a criminal defense attorney or a criminal justice attorney. I always, worked for a couple of judges through my education, and ultimately, they steered me towards more complex legal problems and some policy issues and things like that. But how I got into cannabis, well, there's two answers to that question. How I got into cannabis is I started to tell you that story, the prototype back in the day. But so that group of people were also huge Grateful Dead heads, which is something that's near and dear to both of our hearts in many ways and in different ways. And I did a lot of touring, and I spent a lot of time in parking lots and and under bridges and outside of concert venues, and consumed a lot of cannabis back in the day, and that became part of really part of my tale of growing up and how I socialized and how I took care of myself and how I ended up making friends and doing those things. But how it became a professional objective is a little bit of a different story. I was a commercial litigator. I worked at a large firm. I was on a pathway where I was trying cases for banks and large corporations. I started my own law firm to sort of take some of that work with me. And then ultimately, I started to see that cannabis was legal as early as the early 1990s here in Colorado, but for medical uses, there were no dispensaries. And there was a criminal defense attorney in town here in Denver who became well known. And I got to know him and got to know his wife and his family at the time. And as the issues evolved, it was not that you needed a criminal defense attorney. You needed an attorney who could write contracts. You needed an attorney who could examine leases. You needed an attorney that understood zoning. You needed an attorney that understood how to file for registrations for business permits. You needed an attorney who could protect IP and give tax advice. And so that really was my entry point into the industry. It was also very personal for me because I met this particular criminal defense attorney. Rob Corey was his name, in Colorado at the time. because of my mother. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And if you know anything about pancreatic cancer, it largely is a death sentence, unfortunately, and technology hasn't evolved that much. She was given 6 months to live. So she lived in New Jersey. I was in Colorado. My kids were very young at the time. So she would do her chemo in New Jersey, and she'd come out here for 7 to 10 days when she wasn't doing her chemo to spend time with me and my kids and my family. One morning, as I was sitting across the table from her, I would make her breakfast every morning before I went to work. And I'm looking at my old BlackBerry, the BlackBerry Pearl. They're sitting there with a little ball and reading my emails at the table. And I see my mom taking these pills that the doctor gave her to her mouth. And I see like a big wad of drool come out of her mouth at the time. And it really just, it was like, the body was almost like reaching out to get that medicine. It was pure addiction, not because she was doing anything inappropriate. She was using, but these are powerful Oxycontins, right? And Oxy 80s at the time. To deal with the pain and everything else. So it just really made my stomach turn. And I started to, being no stranger to cannabis, I started to look into, the medicinal aspects of cannabis. How can I help my mom? It's legal here in Colorado. Maybe she'd use it if it was legal, because my mother was not going to use anything or smoke anything that was illegal. And that's kind of how I got into it. I started to reach out to caregivers that there were no dispensaries at the time. So caregivers online that would say, hey, we make crackers, we make oils, we make cookies, because there was a caregiver networks where you could legally go to these people. And sometimes you'd get the person on the phone, they'd say, I got the best stuff in town. And, I'd say duly noted, but I'm looking for something different from my mom because she wasn't going to smoke anything. So we eventually found something that was kind of like a precursor to the old Chiba Chews. Chiba Chews being Tootsie Rolls that were infused with THC oil. And we'd slice these Tootsie Rolls credit card thin and take a piece, 2 pieces, 3 pieces. We experimented together till we got sort of a good routine. And she couldn't tell her chemo doctors back in Philadelphia that she was doing this. So when she came out here, she was seeing relief. And, and I saw the impact that opiates had taken on her. Proud to say my mother did live for about 3.5 years, but some of those ultimately pancreatic cancer takes you, and it did. But those were more peaceful years, more beneficial years, and ultimately those people that I procured cannabis from at the time, they become some of my first clients. So you're an attorney, Hoban. Maybe you could help me come up with a theory how I can sell more cannabis legally with protection. And I said, I'll do you one better. It's in the Colorado Constitution that you have a constitutional right to be a caregiver. And a caregiver says you can manufacture, distribute, and prepare cannabis. So anyway, we sort of drove that theory to the max and pushed for dispensaries before regulation, and dispensaries became a constitutionally protected right. I won a big case called the Canamart case, Frazier versus the city of Centennial, in 2009. And after that case, cannabis was regulated and it was legal in Colorado, and that model began to sweep the nation.
That's awesome. If you hear some meowing in the background, that is Jasper. He is almost 14, and he's a grumpy old man who wants my attention. He's studio cat for the day. So he says hi.
Hi, Jess.
Now I'm thinking that, I think that a lot of us have very similar stories because it was so impactful. It's like, how could you ignore it? Pancreatic cancer. My mother is she's retired now, but she's a hematology oncology nurse and a cancer researcher. She actually did the clinical trials on the chemo that I took when I was going through colon cancer. And one of the things I remember hearing from her was that pancreatic cancer was incredibly painful. It was a really, really hard cancer to deal with. And when you're sick, it's amazing, because before I ever got sick, if I ever asked for anything that would change my state of mind, whether it was like something to help me sleep or help with anxiety, you're immediately drug-seeking behavior. But the minute that you have a cancer diagnosis, they give you everything under the sun, and it isn't always for the best because it has side effects on its own. And to be able to replace some of those harmful pharmaceuticals with cannabis must have felt really good for you as a son.
It did, and it opened my eyes. And if I knew even a fraction of what I know today, or what we generally know today about science, about cannabis, it would have been another story. I mean, in part, I knew that, again, no stranger to marijuana at any point during that stage, but I knew, obviously, if your stomach's upset, you have nausea, that was a common symptom. All right, use some cannabis. If you have a terrible headache, it might not always take the headache away, but it'll give you an attitude adjustment and just lighten things up, and maybe that'll release some of the stress in your head, and then you can calm down a little bit. So that was basically what I knew about it. But again, I was left to experiment on my own, and it makes me mad that I couldn't have walked into a store like I can today and said, hey, I'd like to try 10 of these different things with my mom. And said it was my brother and I sort of going and trying to figure out different things that we could do that weren't smoking cannabis. And it's, it makes you sad on one hand, but it also makes you proud to realize that we've come so far with so many people in this giant groundswell to the point where cannabis is recognized as medicine internationally. It's no longer laughed at. And that's one thing I will say is several years ago when Mitt Romney was running for president, there was a debate at the University of Denver. And our common friend and good friend, Ricardo Baca, was there as on behalf of the cannabis at the time for the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. But Mitt Romney was asked a question by some Denver reporter. Tell us what you think about cannabis policy. And he looked like to say, come on, guys, ask me something real. I'm not talking about cannabis. Politicians can't dodge this question anymore. Everyone needs to have a position developed around it. That in and of itself tells me how far we've come, let alone the access to patients and the knowledge about medicine. So those are some great milestones that I'm proud of and that we should all be proud of.
Still smoking joints? Okay, we need to talk. If you love cannabis but you're still lighting it, let's look at what's actually happening. When you burn flower, you're creating smoke, and that smoke contains harmful compounds like tar, soot, benzene, and formaldehyde. In fact, almost 200 different compounds have been detected in joint smoke. So how do we know this? PAX decided to study it. In controlled lab testing, they compared joint smoke to vapor from their devices, using the same flower under the same conditions, and measured 16 key harmful compounds. The result is pretty striking. Vaporization reduced those compounds by more than 95%, because when you heat cannabis instead of burning it, you change what you inhale. You still get cannabinoids and flavor, just without all the extra stuff that comes from smoke. This isn't about judgment, it's about information. If you want to learn more, go to pax.com/science. Pax is setting higher standards so you can smoke less smoke. And for Planted listeners, get 20% off at pax.com with code PLANTED20. Yeah, it's definitely been one of those things where, well, working in policy, I had a conversation with Bo Whitney not too long. Actually, when we were in Barcelona for Spanibus, and I was asking him about, data and policy. And I said, does it help? And he's like, policy is emotional. We put the data out there, but the policies are largely based on emotions. But at the same time, when I see what goes on with policy, especially in my state of California, I notice how out of touch a lot of the legislators are about the needs of their constituents, and how stigma still really informs a lot of the policies that we're looking at. And as we get into legalization, we're seeing in the United States a lot of the patients being forgotten, and a lot of the products that were helping people in medicinal days have gone away because it's been far too hard for these companies to survive. And then unpacking that even further, then when we look at the greater industry, a lot of times they're saying, hey, we're struggling. We're not having really good sales. Our stores are closing. We can't pay our vendors. And the companies themselves are wondering what's going on, like why these products that are very useful aren't getting highlighted as much. But I think a lot of it has to do with having the conversations about education and the fact that, back in the medicinal days, people used to think we were using it as an excuse to get people access to cannabis, that it wasn't really medicinal. Like when people would joke, and I'm guilty of it myself, I'm smoking this for my glaucoma, and like giggle.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, for those of us who know either have experienced it ourselves or somebody that we love has gone through it, it's very essential. And we have this huge swath of the public that would look at it through either a medicinal or wellness lens, and it's been largely untapped due to the race to the top with THC and the race to the bottom with sales of flower, and the fact that we're not talking about we're not educating the public a lot about what the other modes of use are, minor cannabinoids, how to figure out dosage because of either sheer laziness, the fact that operators think that it impacts their ROI negatively, which is totally untrue. It's actually really helpful. And also the dance around compliance.
Well, when you talk about medical uses too, I mean, to your point, it was always seen, Normal, the longstanding organization, and Keith and all of that work that Normal had put in over all these years, focusing on medical cannabis. It was a bit of an eye roll for a long, long time because the education wasn't out there. It was like, oh, you're just trying to say it's medicinal so you can legalize it. That was sort of the notion out there. But, and then there's this other counter position that all cannabis use is medicinal use. I'm not sure I'd go that far, except to say that certainly when you consume phytocannabinoids, to your point earlier, it interacts with a system in your body that's designed to promote homeostasis. I mean, that's the thing that people don't really understand is, does cannabis cure cancer? No. Does cannabis do this? Cannabis goes into your body, interacts with a system that's designed to promote homeostasis. And that is the best explanation I've ever had from physicians and doctors and researchers to understand why cannabis is medicinal. But at the end of the day, it was always seen as subterfuge. Let's legalize it for medical purposes. It kind of goes back to the snake oil salesman back in the day, selling alcohol out of the back of wagons for medicinal use. But, was that alcohol actually medicinal or not? Those were the decisions, and that's the history we had to deal with. But I don't know, the stigma has been removed in a very short period of time, and not removed entirely. Obviously, there's still massive stigma around cannabis, and with different political parties in charge, we see more stigma asserted, we see less stigma asserted. But it's kind of this notion that, let's stop for a moment and realize how far and how fast we've come. Look at states that in under 5 years saw a growth of medical cannabis and then turned around and started to regulate it. And then within a couple of years after that, many of these states turned around and created adult use systems. So it was a massive education on a major scale, even for people that may not admit it, but they used cannabis, to have any idea about the practical applications of what it can do, who it can help. Once politicians started to see veterans and children, the old Charlotte Figi story and things analogous to that, the Sanjay Gupta and CNN story. Once it began to become recognized, then people started to pay attention and policymakers couldn't turn away. And I think that's kind of the thing that we don't give ourselves enough credit for, is we want the industry to be the way we want it to be. We want the plant to be freed and regulated, but freed more like tobacco, perhaps, in terms of, its regulation than a strictly regulated medicine. But we have to realize we come really, really far in a short period of time. To the Mitt Romney story, to the point that states, within a few years, states don't take a banned substance and then all of a sudden start regulating it for adult use sales just because of tax revenue. It's because politicians and policymakers became educated, and that education piece continues to this day. Your podcast adds a lot to that, and I give you a ton of credit for that. It's many people that write, that broadcast, that put together information so that people can become educated, because I don't want my education about cannabis from a doctor. I need the information about the science, but I'm not going to listen to a doctor. Some people listen to doctors. Some people listen to media. So you have to sort of create this balance where education is multifaceted, and I think we're getting there. But let's give ourselves credit for a moment and realize how far we've come in a really, really short period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes my breath away because when I first started, we were just beginning to have conversations about CBD.
Well, so let me tell you about CBD. So this is, and I wanted to talk about this. So I'm glad you broke that up. So I'm just going to dive in with it. CBD, I didn't know what CBD was, right? I had a client who was the largest CBD producer in the country, in California, a company called Cannavest. They are now CV Sciences, and obviously this was many years ago. Cannavest calls me because a friend of mine became a salesperson for them. used to work with a salesperson that went to that company in the natural products industry, fish oil in particular, Nordic Naturals. He says, can you write a legal letter that says CBD is legal? I go, what's CBD? Oh, it's a cannabinoid in a plant. Well, what are cannabinoids? I mean, literally, this whole education happened in 12 to 16 years for me, let alone, the masses. CBD was a major craze because it was being imported from overseas, from hemp, allegedly. And CBD became a major door opener for people to begin to understand cannabinoids. We still don't fully understand CBD outside of inflammation and some other things. But at the end of the day, it was that movement, that push of, yes, here's what CBD is. Someone in the industry like me didn't know what CBD was, and it was my job to figure it out and to sort of help steer and write a legal opinion letter. And those legal opinion letters really opened up the door to the point where we actually had that lawsuit against the DEA in 2016 involving CBD, because the DEA kept saying CBD is a controlled substance. It's a controlled substance. It was never a controlled substance. If it came from marijuana, yes, but what if it came from hemp? Hemp was legal, and hemp was legal in many of the states. Or if it was produced internationally from other parts of the planet, it was legal. So CBD became a great test case for educating the masses on something other than the intoxicating effects of cannabis. And I think that's your point. But I'm happy that you mentioned that, because we go back, we're talking about the hemp versus marijuana problems today. This all started with CBD. Without CBD, hemp-derived CBD being an issue, being a commercially accepted protocol, being sold as an additive in coffees. I saw CBD pillows, CBD firewood, CBD in everything you could possibly come up with for a period of time years ago. It still exists today, but it was really, really exacerbated years ago. The question becomes, what did the rise, maybe the fall of CBD, I guess it's risen again, what did that teach the masses? How did that contribute to education? I think that's what told people that cannabinoids were something different than just smoking weed.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it was really interesting to see how that all panned out. Like, a lot of us used to jokingly say it was like the dad in My Big Fat Greek Wedding with the Windex that he sprayed on everything. CBD was like that for a while.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I remember having somebody come to my class. It was actually a whole family, and they were in the back of the class. And I used to get that a lot, especially if somebody had a sick family member, like a group would come. And at the end, they asked me, is CBD the plant or the seed? And I had to explain to them what it was. But the thing that frightened me was that they were actually taking part in a multi-level marketing company with CBD and had no idea what they were working with. So it was kind of a twofold thing, because the conversation did lead to normalization. And that was really good, because when you could get hemp-based CBD products from somewhere that's not a dispensary, because even to this day, there are a lot of people who are intimidated about going into a dispensary. Oh my God, what if someone sees me? Or, I don't know, questions to ask. They know what to do if they go to CVS. But then on the other hand, you had a lot of people that were pushing stuff out that was, questionable at best. But we saw that on the cannabis side too. And it made for good comedy. But I used to always ask myself, how does this push the movement forward? But getting back into hemp, because I wanted to ask you about this before we start talking about rescheduling. So the hemp industry is kind of up in the air right now. And the other week, Curaleaf made an announcement that they were no longer going to be working in hemp. Do you think that with rescheduling coming up and them figuring out what's going on with hemp, because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. My thought was that it's this, and I've always thought that hemp products should be more regulated, cannabis products should be less. You should meet somewhere in between, and we should be able to have them at any store that you get cannabis, you should be able to get hemp, and vice versa. Do you think that with the rescheduling, they're going to lump hemp for human consumption in there? Like, what are your thoughts about what's happening? Because when Curaleaf did that was a big sign to me that there's some change afoot, and there are some things going on behind closed doors. Or is Boris just like, fuck it, hemp, not doing it?
Discover the power of Yorma's Choice CBD products. When we chose a sober life, we searched for the best CBD to manage our chronic pain. In Raywood, Kentucky, the home of Bickett and Boone, we found the perfect solution. Yorma's Choice is a range of topicals, tinctures, bath salts, and gummies. Choose Yorma's Choice for pain-free living. Shop now at furpeaceranch.com. FURPEACERANCH.com.
Yeah, but first of all, a lot of those MSOs, I'm not saying this is the case with Curaleaf, but a lot of the MSOs say one thing and then do another because they set it up, in a creative way where it's not. I'm not saying Curaleaf is doing this. I'm saying, but
Right, absolutely.
The main company might not be the one selling CBD. They create a subsidiary that does. But I think what we're doing is we're starting to see this distinction between the industry. The industry is evolving. Do you want to be a medicinal ingredient supplier, or do you want to be a flower supplier? As part of the counterculture, if you will. I think they're very different things, and let's think about the pharmaceutical or medicinal applications of cannabis for a moment. I think most Americans that have not used cannabis, it's because they don't want to eat it. They don't want to smoke it. They'd rather go to a doctor and have a pill prescribed. And some of the FDA-approved pills and medicines right now, it's not necessarily naturally occurring. It's not full spectrum. The cannabis, the CBD, the THC, whatever the concoction is, from Marinol on down the road. So there's really not a lot of options for people that don't want to consume a natural plant to use medicinal cannabis. And I think that's true for the rest of the world as well. So if you think about it, what are the impactful parts of the plant? The impactful parts of the plant are the cannabinoids. Obviously, there's terpenes. There's other components of the plant that have an impact. But we're specifically talking about cannabinoids in this context for medicinal purposes. So aren't cannabinoids then just ingredients? They're just ingredients. A pharmaceutical company's not buying flour because that flour is the best blue dream they ever saw, or the best, Durban poison, whatever it might be. They're buying a plant because it has an expression of cannabinoids that they're then going to extract, isolate, and create a formulation based on. That's medicine. So if you're going to efficiently produce cannabinoids as an ingredient for a pharmaceutical supply chain, then you need a lot of plant material. If you need a lot of plant material with less regulation, less cost to grow, it only makes sense that you would use hemp to produce those cannabinoids, because it doesn't matter what the flower is. You're not selling the flower for a medicinal purpose. You're not selling the flower to a patient. You're selling a pill or a tincture or an oil or a concoction that was formulated based on extracted, isolated cannabinoids. Now, that makes purists roll over, in their graves from a long-standing standpoint and just from a philosophical standpoint. And I'm not taking a position one way or another. I'm just saying, look at it from a supply chain perspective. You need cannabinoids. The easiest way to get cannabinoids to fill a supply chain that's global is to use hemp, because it's less regulated. It's the exact same plant, just has different ratios of cannabinoids, and I can grow it without regard to whether the flowers are beautiful and smell great. I'm just looking for consistency and cannabinoid content. Now, the other side of the spectrum is, what if I'm selling a flower? So if I'm selling a flower, it's got to smell good, it's got to taste good, it's got to produce a desired effect. Is Curaleaf, using that example, are MSOs in the business of selling medicine, or are they in the business of selling a flower that can be used for individual purposes, whether that's medicinal, adult use, recreational, or not? That's the line in the sand, and nobody really knows where they fit because it's not a defined supply chain right now. Schedule 3, we'll talk about, like you said, in a moment, is going to change that. But to your question, can hemp and marijuana coexist? I think you need hemp as the backbone of the global cannabis supply chain because it's easier to extract from, it's easier to produce, there's less regulation, and you're not necessarily having to produce it under such strict conditions where the flower has to be beautiful. It just has to be consistent. If you're producing medicinal marijuana, you've seen, multi-million-dollar facilities that are indoor that are intended to produce these beautiful flowers with these beautiful ratios. And some people believe that the flower ratios themselves are designed to treat specific conditions in the human body. So people will tell you that there's, a ratio of cannabinoids in a particular flower that is great for epilepsy, or it's great for diabetes or whatever. And those things are scientifically proven to be true. But that's not the way our medicinal supply chain works globally. Globally, you take the individual cannabinoids, you smack them together in a formulation, you get the formulation approved, you prove its efficacy, and then you sell it as pills, tinctures, or otherwise. So there's room for all of it, is the point. The question becomes, should people be selling intoxicated hemp derivatives over the counter today versus across state lines, international lines, in gas stations, in grocery stores, and liquor stores, or should they have to go buy intoxicating cannabinoids in dispensaries? Well, this becomes a market question. Consumers don't like dispensaries. Consumers don't want to go to dispensaries. If a cannabis product was available in a Circle K or at 7-Eleven, any kind of convenience store, could I walk into that convenience store? I'd feel more comfortable when I buy my potato chips and my gasoline and my coffee, and I could buy, just like I might buy a 40 ounce of, Old English or something from back in the day, or a 6-pack of beer at the convenience store, I could buy some cannabis as well. These companies don't really know where they're going to fit at the end of the day in the supply chain, because the distribution outlets are not defined by the government yet. Dispensaries aren't liked. Medicine is too narrow. Intoxicating compounds that can just be sold anywhere without regulation isn't the right thing to do because it's not consumer protection. These are the questions we need to answer. And Schedule 3, I'm not sure really helps us answer that.
Yeah. Well, I always, when I still worked in retail, I used to talk a lot to the staff about modes of use when talking to consumers. Don't recommend something that somebody's not comfortable using. And one of the things, especially in our culture, but I think in most cultures are drinking cultures. Well, they're beverage oriented, even if they don't consume alcohol. Where my father's from in Iran, they're a tea drinking culture, but there's a beverage that goes with social events. And what we're seeing in places like Georgia and Minneapolis, where there are hemp-derived CBD beverages that are available for, social consumption especially in Minnesota, in restaurants, in bars. I was talking to Congresswoman Ilana Omar about this, and I was asking her, have there been any white papers written to talk about these social environments where there's consumption and alcohol is also available, and how people are behaving? Because I feel like when you normalize the purchasing point and their social consumption, people tend to chill out. Like I feel like there's a much more responsible reaction to it than we ever thought possible. Because when I was co-chair of the legalization task force here in San Francisco, one of the biggest questions that we had was about social consumption. Because, I don't just hang out with people who use cannabis. I hang out with people who don't have a problem with me using cannabis, but when we go out, they would opt for a glass of Pinot or a bourbon rather than having a cannabis beverage.
Mm-hmm.
But for myself, even though I like those too, I opt for cannabis because it makes me feel better. And when we've been working with, over the pandemic, we had friends who would come hang out with us because we would entertain in our garden, in our front yard. Some of them hadn't had cannabis in a while. Some of them had never had it. And when you give them it in a format that's familiar to them, low dosage format, it's friendly, it's something they can be curious about. A lot of them actually tried it and were like, hey, I think I'm going to go and actually get this. Or, I have to go to a sometimes when it was going to a dispensary, they're like, oh, well, next time you go, could you pick some up for me too? But some people, it would actually get them in the door. But as we're seeing things at, just regular beverage stores, I mean, the sheer volume of interest, the purchases, those are not all made by people who go to dispensaries by any stretch of the imagination. I would say, and counselor, I don't know, being an attorney, you may be like, well, I don't know. But I would say that a majority of those people probably did not. And that was their first step in the door of purchasing a legal cannabinoid that was euphoric.
I would agree with you. And it's to your point, it's the distribution outlet. What store do I go to? Am I comfortable in? if that's sold in the store that I'm comfortable in, i.e. the liquor store, and then I'm probably going to be more comfortable because it shows that somehow, it's assumed that this means it's okay because the liquor store wouldn't sell it because they sell other products that, yes, there's problems with alcohol, obviously, but alcohol has been regulated and normalized to the point where there are guidelines for, I don't know, healthy use is the wrong way to put it, but non-abusive use is perhaps the right way to put it. So it's assumed that they're okay. And by the way, who would have saw that coming? That the alcohol sector is the one educating the masses about THC consumption. Not me, but I will tell you that THC beverages are indeed here to stay. Alcohol use is down quarter after quarter, year after year. What we're seeing right now is a regulatory reset. By no means are these things going away. This is a regulatory reset. That's why you saw the ban language come from Washington, D.C. surrounding hemp, so that the alcohol industry can assert itself and say, look, we want to play in this. We already own the channels. We know how we want to do this. We know how this is done. The government's comfortable with the way we do things. So let's put the rules around it. A, it's regulatory capture, so we get to control it. But B, let's just slow down a minute and create the rules so then all these beverage brands that are out there in so many states will continue to exist, that I don't believe that THC-derived beverages are going to be banned or pulled. All of that's going to come around. And to your point about the outlets and normalization, I mean, for years now, there's been outlets across the South. There's a chain of restaurants called Buds and Brews where you could sit down and have a beer and you can have, infused THC hot sauce on your buffalo wings at the same time. And that's been going on for years. But the alcohol thing is interesting, or at least the beverage thing is interesting, because if you look at Minnesota, you can sell these beverages anywhere that alcohol is sold. Concerts, ball games, any events, you can serve it. You can sell it at liquor stores, and that does tend to normalize things and give consumers that confidence. So make no mistake about it, the THC beverages are here to stay. The question is, from a regulatory and legal standpoint, can you only legalize THC beverages and ban gummies and ban vapes and ban everything else? And should those things be sold in Circle K's and 7-Elevens or in dispensaries? And this is where, to one of the points you made earlier, this is where I have a major problem. Because the marijuana sector, in my mind, the cannabis industry has two distinct sectors, and I'm using the legal terms of art. You got industrial hemp and you have marijuana. So hemp and marijuana are the two distinct sectors of the cannabis industry. The marijuana sector doesn't want to see the hemp sector survive because it's too easy for them. And yes, there's bad actors, but there's bad actors on both sides, right? That are operating outside of regulations. So do you want to bring the hemp industry down and try to get rid of it? Can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, to your point. But what you can do is bring the marijuana industry down so that its outlets are more recognized, more normalized, and not just dispensaries. And that's something that I'm not seeing enough discussion about, because I think that's the right policy objective. And then with rescheduling, you have this whole medicinal avenue, pharmaceutical avenue, which has nothing, I mean nothing, to do with dispensaries in the United States, because dispensaries are like a square peg in a round hole under the FDA, DEA registration guidelines. It just doesn't fit. The only things that could potentially fit under the current iteration of the law is you got cultivators and manufacturers that could become DEA Schedule III registrants ultimately when that process has run its course, and they can begin to export, but they're not going to be able to be allowed to sell into dispensaries, because dispensaries aren't regulated Schedule III dispensation outlets. So these are the problems and the challenges, but the industry still doesn't know what it is yet. Is it medicinal? Is it adult use? Is it pharmaceutical? Is it OTC? Is it wellness products? Is it all of the above? The answer is yes, it is all of the above, but that creates a major problem from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. When people ask me about, the rescheduling, I was looking like, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen. I'm like, think about this. Xanax is Schedule III. Do you see Xanax dispensaries on in your neighborhood on the corner? No, you don't. So,
but ketamine, you do see it. You see, I don't mean you see ketamine dispensaries, but you see easier access to products that are Schedule III. It's still in a tightly regulated system, and I hate to say it ain't dispensaries.
Right. It isn't. Yeah. So you have been doing international policy for how long now?
For a very long time now. I taught, I was one of the first cannabis professors in the country at the University of Denver for years. And because of that, I was fortunate to lead a group of students on one of 3 international travel trips from the University of Denver. The first was to Uruguay. I was working for the Uruguayan government, helping advise them on cannabis legislation before they legalized with the now deceased former president, Pepe Mujica, wonderful man. And I brought 14 students from the University of Denver down to Uruguay on that trip. For a joint course with the Catholic University of Uruguay. Now, you can't make this stuff up, Sarah. I'm at the Legislative Palace, which is like their Congress. And there happens to be a sign that says, we're just doing a tour that day, meeting a couple politicians. It says, Latin American Conference on Cannabis Policy Reform. That's the sign that just so happens to be going on in this room. And I walk into the room, and this was 2015, 16. 15 or 16. In any event, the guy at the podium, I walk in with my students, and it's a very small room. The guy at the podium happened to be a deputy from Costa Rica, who I had advised the Costa Rican government in 2014. And he sees me, and the room's so small, I have to walk right in front of the podium. And he says, Mr. Hoban, he says, what are you doing here? He kind of breaks his Spanish for a second, and because I knew the guy. And, he sort of says it with a smile, then he jumps back into what he was talking. We stepped on the side and ended up talking. So all these public health ministers from Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, they're in this room, and they think that I'm some big deal. I got a suit on. I did some cannabis policy advising, but just because nobody else in the world was doing it, and I was in Colorado from the University of Denver, and what we were talking about made cogent sense. And all of a sudden, I start getting calls and having interviews for the next several days with public health ministers. And then I became internationally known as a cannabis policy expert and helped devise cannabis policy and advise on policy reform. Since that, I've worked in over 30 countries around the world, directly engaged by the government. And most recently finished a job with the Moroccan government. That's a very challenging country to work in, but also the largest cannabis producer in the world. And I have great hopes for that country and its people in that regard. But that's the story, and that's how it started. And sometimes I pinch myself, and I can't believe that that's the way it happened. But yes, and we would do this sort of choose your own adventure, like Q&A thing. Remember the choose your own adventure books from back in the day?
Totally.
All right. Here's what's going on in the world right now from a cannabis policy perspective. Here's what your neighbors are doing. And I'd know which neighbors they liked and which neighbors they didn't. And so then that painted a spectrum where I knew that they were going to emotionally be. To your point about Bo Whitney's comment about policy being emotional, I knew they weren't going to do what this country wanted to do because they didn't like that country. But they might want to do what this country did. So I'd paint this spectrum and say, well, here's the options, whether it was labeling or dispensation or regulation or the cultivation rules. How do you do these things? And we'd create this sort of choose your own adventure type rulemaking process where we gave them advice and created a model regulatory program. Now, they didn't all adopt those programs, but at least they were educated. And since that time, they've moved forward. But really, that was really, really fun to see and really opportunistic because right now, there's nearly 36 countries in the world that are using large pieces of what I put together many years ago. And I'm proud to say that.
This episode is brought to you by Fat Nugs Magazine, a global perspective of cannabis and stoner culture as a bridge to the rest of the world. Right now, you can join Fat Nugs Magazine, Beard Bros Farms, Freedom Grow, and Jailed for Weed in the upcoming Prisoners Edition and help spotlight current and past cannabis prisoners and their stories, because no one should be in jail for a plant. Find Fat Nugs Magazine's beautiful print copies at your local dispensary, fatnugsmag.com, and on socials. Cannabis culture welcomes us all. That's really cool. I mean, I was really wondering how that would pan out because, for me, I've done a lot of work with policy throughout the United States. And the one thing that kind of took my breath away, that got me to sit back and really think, was really realizing that each one of these states has a culture and a feel onto themselves. Like we are kind of like a bunch of little countries that all speak the same language under the same roof. I mean, what we do, here in California, I think there are similarities between Colorado and California, although California is more of a cautionary tale. And then you look at like when I was doing work in Arkansas, how different the culture was. And I always try to use, because, a lot of times in the States, everyone beats up on California. So I'm like, okay, all right. You're like, we think we're so great. You don't want to do what we do. But hey, what if I say, don't do what we do? Like, use this as a cautionary tale. Can I use your the way you kind of feel that we think we're so great as a way to compel you to do the right thing?
That was always my tact. I am not some American here to tell you what to do. Far, far be it. I'm here to tell you that we made a lot of mistakes and steer clear of these landmines. But Sarah, what you're talking about is what I call the why, right? Every jurisdiction in the world has a why. Why did they legalize cannabis? Is it economic opportunity? Is it job creation? Is it medicinal access? Is it to create new industry? Is it to have social justice reform, cultural reform like Morocco? That's a really interesting case study when you think about integrating the Berbers, this entire region of Morocco that's historically grown cannabis, 60,000 hectares a year of cannabis, and they're sort of outlaws, and the government wants to integrate them. So there's a cultural reason there. Then you have, obviously criminal justice reform reasons. The why. The states that do it. California started from, again, I know this from the outside, not being in California and knowing some of the folks that pushed it in California, but it started from, the AIDS epidemic, and Dennis Perone and those folks that sort of really pushed for true medicinal access to solve a true public health problem in the state. And then that's what opened the door. And other states said, well, we saw the economic opportunity, so we jumped on the train. Had nothing to do with medicine or compassion in that regard at all. And no reason is right or wrong. It's just you have to recognize the why, and the why is multi-layered. What's the main reason they want it? What are the cultural factors at play? What's the language barrier and the level of conservatism or progressivism that is at play? These are all the things you got to take into effect, because there is no one size fits all, which is why we're in this predicament to begin with hemp versus marijuana and adult use versus medical and international versus the US and everything else, is because there is no one way to do it. So I prefer to look at everything like the development of a supply chain. So how can I develop a supply chain that supplies all of these whys, all of these uses in the lowest common denominator way that is the most consumer friendly and pursuant to the highest standards in the world? And that's what's happening. And that's where I prefer to spend my time, and not arguing about whether these products should be sold in dispensaries or Circle K's. But obviously it should be both.
Yeah, absolutely. When I would talk to policymakers, one of the things I used to say when we get into legalization was, do you understand, like, not only does it create job opportunities, I'm like, but for the first time ever, for young people, supply chain management might actually feel like a sexy thing to get into in college.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Just like lawyers are going to school to become cannabis lawyers. By the way, this was one of my proudest moments of being a lawyer, is when I was reached out by a student at the University of New Mexico Law School. Gosh, 12 years ago now. He says, I'm going to school to be a cannabis attorney. And I said, a cannabis attorney? What does a cannabis attorney do? Because, I never really thought of myself as a cannabis attorney. We service the cannabis industry, but we're just attorneys. We built a law firm with, lawyers that serviced all these different legal needs and applied it to one industry because nobody else was doing it, and we liked it. And I think that to your point, now people are going to law school to be a cannabis attorney, even though that word doesn't have a specific meaning. It just means you work in the cannabis industry and you do a bunch of different things. But I'm proud of so many great lawyers that push the envelope, that really develop their practices and develop law firms and develop things to this day and growing to this day to really, in the face of federal legality, lawyers are a conservative bunch. And lawyers stepping out and going to work in a federally illegal industry to this day in major law firms all around the world, my hat goes off to those folks, and proud to be a part of that. Really, really, really. But supply chain management is sexy. A cannabis attorney is sexy. Being an attorney is being an attorney. There's not a whole lot of sexiness about it, except now you could be a cannabis attorney, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think that the opportunities are amazing because when we, you know, for a while you had to be really careful about who you had as an attorney because, I always joke that our industry is kind of like land of misfit toys. There are really great people, there are some quirky people, there are some people that, swim with the sharks and the pirates, but so there's a lot of different things. But like before I worked in cannabis, I was in civil rights. I worked for Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area. And we had a pro bono program called Legal Services for Entrepreneurs. And when we got into legalization here in California, and we have, different groups like success centers and things like that that are working with equity operators to help them set up, I was really worried about some of the people that were getting into these, that were helping with these programs, were slightly predatory because they weren't able to do work in other places. They were coming into cannabis. They weren't like you, Bob, where you're like, there's a reason, there's an ethos, and we see that in many different areas in cannabis. So I reached out to the legal director of my old nonprofit, who's a dear friend, and I was like, hey, now that it's legal Services for Entrepreneurs program, would you be interested in talking to the attorneys? Because they were getting people from like Morrison Forrester, Oric, things like that coming in.
By the way, best website name of all time, mofo.com.
Right?
I thought I'd throw that out there.
I know. I love that. We always would call it mofo. And it was like, yes. And we had a Jim. Oh gosh. I can't remember. Anyway. Jim Brosnahan was on our board, who is an amazing attorney and a partner at MoFo. And he was like one of those guys that was like, yeah, he was an attorney, but he showed up in cowboy boots and a leather jacket and he knew his shit. I really liked him. But I asked her, I said, would you be open to supporting equity operators through your program now that we're into legalization? She's like, funny thing that you mentioned that because all these big firms that, get a lot of their pro bono hours through us, some of these attorneys have actually been asking, are you getting any cannabis entrepreneurs coming through, any cannabis companies that we could actually help? And so I was able to make a connection for them with some of the organizations that are supporting these folks. And hopefully some things are happening with that because I think it's really important. It is an all hands on deck issue. And, it is still a civil rights issue. It's, especially when we're looking at people who were traditionally jailed for either cannabis use or being entrepreneurs, illegal entrepreneurs in the industry, they are the most impacted. And so if these talented folks don't get a leg up, what's going to happen?
No, you're right. And I remember, to your point about the land of misfit toys, I remember going to a big law firm. I was invited. I always believed in marketing when I built my law firm. We marketed really, really aggressively using social media, et cetera. So we became pretty well known pretty quickly at the Hoban Law Group back in the day. And we got invited to this big firm, Cadwalader, in Washington, D.C., and they had all these big firm attorneys. And these were all smart, wonderful people. Some of them still work in the space today. But they were talking about all of the legal issues that we did. My firm at its height had 92 lawyers in 10 countries around the world before I sold it to Clark Hill. My lawyers were doing this every day for years. And they're talking about, well, maybe there's going to be an IP issue with the registration of a plant. They're talking about these things in the hypothetical. Meanwhile, they've already been happening for years. Good lawyers have been doing work for years. That was the problem that I identified as these were smart lawyers. They were good lawyers, but they were coming at it as if it was all just brand new. And yes, brand new is a relative concept, but they were trying to approach problems the way they approached every other legal problem. And in this industry, it's just different. And you had to give some deference for how the industry operated and the illegality component and just the manner of doing business. And I think that oftentimes got lost in the shuffle. But one thing I would say, just, one of the recent events that we were all at, MJ BizCon, of course, in Las Vegas, the big annual gathering event. And people said, well, attendance was way down and this and that. And I think that because of where the industry is, its financial situation is tight. it's sort of got a lot of these people that were taking a look at the industry, or the people that came in to say, hey, you need me because I did this in CPG or whatever. They're largely gone now. So it's just the people that are in the industry are people that can deliver results in whatever field they're in: PR, legal, accounting, consulting, operations, so on and so forth down the road. So I do think that right now you've kind of gotten rid of the people following the sharks and the unicorns, although some of them still exist. And it's funneled down to a group of solid producers that have a track record of experience. And you don't need the Pepsi marketing exec to market, because that marketing exec might bring some specific talents to the table, but nothing specific to the industry. And I think that those are some of the problems.
Yeah. And what, you know, people were talking about how quiet it was this year, but I also heard from a lot of people, and I experienced this myself. I feel like this was one of the years that I actually had some of the most real conversations and got some of the most business done because of that, because we were able to cut through a lot of the fluff. A lot of the people who were kind of there, I used to say, the smell of desperation and the sound of kicking tires, you know. It wasn't as much this year. It was like, you know, there's always going to be people who are like, oh, wah, 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 you know, but some of them I think would do that even if it was a birthday party. So, you know, but I felt like it was really constructive this year, and it really did reflect like where we're at. It's like, who's left standing, and who are some of the people who are coming up that are going to be power players and really have their shit together. And I'm really excited to see what's going on. I'm excited to see people who have the love of what we're doing and the knowledge, but also can contribute skills that we desperately need as an industry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, looking at that, doing a little bit of a shift, you've done a lot of media. You're not just an attorney. You've been doing a lot of media work. You had your podcast for quite some time, and you're working on some other projects. And can we talk about some of that? Because I think that your unique lens with this, especially from an international perspective, lends a lot to these formats.
Yeah, I think, you know, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with education. I feel like there's a message to be delivered here. And I don't always think that the message about what the industry is and what it's doing is being delivered properly in the media. I've always thought that the message of what always drove me was I got to work with the most interesting, intelligent, driven people that I've ever come across, that I would not have come across in my standard legal world had I not got into the cannabis world. And I'm really, really happy, proud, and just, you know, amazed by all of that. But everyone's a character, right? People are characters.
I love that.
Everyone's a character. I'm a character. You're a character. Everyone's a character. And I mean that in the most positive way, in sense of characteristics of not just being a cookie cutter person in a banking industry, for example, or otherwise. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to embrace as the industry. But someone needs to tell the story of the characters coupled with their intelligence, their hard work, their dedication, and the progress, and really the level of sophistication in the processes and how things are developed, and the different segments of the industry that we were talking about before. It's not all about Snoop Dogg. When people think about cannabis, they think about the Snoop Dogg and the counterculture or the dispensary movement. That's one part of it, and it's a big part of it, but that's not all of it. So those are the stories I wanted to tell. When we were in Iceland talking about industrial hemp as a major focus versus consumption of just cannabinoids. Those are important things for building materials and durable goods and fuels and plastics and beyond. Those are the stories that I always thought needed to be told. So as I wound down my full-time legal career, I still do legal work and consulting work and fractional executive work, but on a limited basis, not the ridiculous hours a week I used to have to do. I decided to pursue this media project, which has always been calling me. As you point out, I've done media, podcast, webinars, content. I did a show years ago on Greenflower Media called The Cannabis Insider, which was kind of a roundtable talk show, which was a cool concept. So we decided to go out and find a way to produce a show that told that story that I just described, but from someone that was not a dispensary owner. I'm not here to talk to you about how I grow cannabis. I'm not here to talk about just legal concepts. I'm here to sort of present those people and sort of channel their story and make it an international component. By the way, that's one of the most fascinating things that I know that you love as well as I do about this industry is the international component and the international folks. Talk about adding a depth of characters that you couldn't make up if you sat down and tried to develop characters. And again, I mention that in the most loving and positive way, as Ringo Starr would say, peace and love, peace and love. But that's neither here nor there to say that's the story I wanted to tell. So we were able to work with a well-known production company, and we produced a lot of content over 60 days in Iceland, in Argentina, in Amsterdam, in Japan, and we've put together some pilot episodes that we're running through some major streaming services. And those major streaming services supported us in the development of this project, in part because of the production team that I'm working with. And we'll see where it goes. We're hopeful that by the spring, we'll have a firm deal in place to broadcast these stories, these episodes, and to really tell the tale, but from an international perspective. And the shows are focused on the people that we can tell the story. And, somebody, kind of said, oh, it sounds like it's the Anthony Bourdain of cannabis show. And that's kind of the concept. I hate to say, not to steal it from the late, great Anthony Bourdain, but somebody needs to tell that story, talk about the people, talk about the culture, marry the old with the new. Iceland was a great example of that, right? Going to Iceland and figuring out where has cannabis traditionally been grown and who distributes it? Well, between us, it's the Albanians, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, can we go talk to people that are in that side of the supply chain and then look at the international opportunities and the policy opportunities and the hemp opportunities that are now legal in Iceland? How do you marry all those concepts together? By telling a tale also of the food and the culture and the music and the outdoors. That's the story we're hoping to tell, and fingers crossed and wish me luck, but we're well along in that process.
I do wish you luck. It's a really cool project. And I think, when we're looking at media, it's all hands on deck because we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of different lenses to look through and to also appeal to educate them. And I just think it's really cool what you're doing. I'm excited for you, and I can't wait to see what it turns out to be. And when you're talking about like the characters in the industry, I think you're right. I mean, I used to joke, that we're all part carny because we're all a little weird, in the most loving way. And I think part of it is that, just like how the tech industry, back in the 90s showed that you could go to work in jeans and still be productive, you can come to your job as your authentic self and still be professional and get things done. And I believe that you have more heartfelt, genuine connections with the people that you're working with. And that's part of what gets me to work every day. I love that. I had the hardest time being in corporate and having this corporate face and to not be able to be my true self. And to be able to do that and feel free to do that in cannabis is a really beautiful thing. And to be able to actually have these authentic connections with our colleagues really warms my heart. And it's a big part of why I do all of this.
No, I feel it and I know it, and it's that level of authenticity that makes you successful, and I think has that's certainly brought me success in my career, and I think that's really is a key when you can be yourself. It opens up doors and it creates better connections, and the industry. Our industry can benefit more greatly from that. So those are some of the things that are happening, and I think that's kind of the mantra going into 2026 too, is to really just continue to tell stories. And I love your recent affiliation with large historical publication and what you're going to be doing with them. I think that's really cool, and I love just, how you tell the stories and the people you get in and the vast perspectives. And I love the fact that you can pull in people from the music industry and from politics and really, really add some credibility and quality reputation, all the while, Sarah, being yourself. And, I think there was one lawyer used to work for me, for me, a tax lawyer, a guy named Ken Baraski. And Ken's retired in New Mexico now, worked for the IRS for years, was a IRS tax attorney. And Ken looked at me one time. I said, Ken, because, my attorneys were all young when I started my firm. I ran my firm for 12 years and I was younger. They were all young attorneys. And Ken's, probably mid-70s now. So I looked at Ken like a father. I said, Ken, am I doing everything right? I mean, is there anything that I need to do differently to keep everybody excited and, to be the right leader for this business? And he just looked at me. He said, Bob, just keep being yourself. Never stop being yourself. And it was kind of like that grandfatherly or fatherly advice that you try to give to people, that respect you. And I'll never forget that. And I think that rings true in this space, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And going into 2026, what are some things that you're excited about and hopeful for?
Oh, excited. I'm nervous about the rescheduling piece. I'm nervous about how cannabis has become a bit of a political football while it was once ignored and then, devotedly paid attention to. And now I feel like it's particularly in this political environment, it's more of a football. So that worries me a little bit. I'm excited to see the development and the continued evolution of the international space. I think we have a lot to learn from how international countries have cooperated with one another in development of their individual programs based on their why, but also in a way that creates international commerce. So I'm really excited about that. I'm excited, to be honest with you, about the fact that I believe we'll see more capital flow into the industry. My hope is that the operators are more responsible with that capital. It was once said to me, how can the industry make so many millions or billions of dollars and just not be profitable? And it's not just the tax 280E issue, although that's one. We won't get into the weeds on that. One reason why the industry doesn't have a great profitable bottom line, it's just the companies aren't always well run. And that's the case in every industry, but there's a lot more of a spotlight on us. So I'm optimistic that the influx of capital and more clarity on regulations and the development of the international space will bring more quality operators into the space. And overall, I don't know. I think the future is really, really bright for our industry. And as much as there's a lot of doom and gloom in the world, when you have personal connections and you do something you love each day, and your family and your friends are all safe, what's there to complain about? Nothing left to do but smile, 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 as they say.
True. Bob, thanks for hanging out with me today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you out and about this year because I know we're going to be in some of the same places, especially in Europe.
Yes. There's some cool stuff coming up in Europe. And I'd encourage any of your listeners, if you're interested in going out and just, having some fun and meeting people from all over the world, there are some great conferences out there internationally. I'd encourage you to go attend them. If you're in the space and you're in the US and you're sitting here going, well, how does the international space relevant to me? I own a dispensary, for example, in Michigan. It is relevant, particularly in the Schedule III landscape. And there's finances, there's opportunity to collaborate, there's branding and cross-branding opportunities. And then there's just great friends to meet all over the world. So I'd encourage people to get out. And thanks to you for having me and for having this conversation. It's been my pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you out on the road as well. I don't even know I'm trying to stay home for the first quarter. We'll see how that goes.
I'm going to stay home for a little bit, but then I'm going to be out. For people who want to follow you, see what you're doing, also keep an eye out for your new project. How do they do that? I'm on social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. But my website is bobhoban.com. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, you can always email me. This is a hard one to remember. It's bob@bobhoban.com. So I love it. Thanks, Bob. And I look forward to the next time we geek out. Ben, again, you're welcome back anytime. I've had so much fun.
It would be my pleasure. And you know what? Jamie and I have threatened to gang up on you and all of us do an episode together, but that's neither here nor there.
Oh, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. Done.
Thanks, Sara. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And everyone, remember, if you like listening, please give us a review, share it with a friend. Let us know what your favorite episodes are. And if you'd like to stay in touch over social media, we are Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook and Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.plantedwithsara.com, or listen to us on our parent network, Radio Misfits Network, where there are other great podcasts, like one of my favorites, the Winemakers Podcast. So check it out. You can listen to Planted wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, whether that's Pandora, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Apple, Stitcher. Tune in. We are there. So join us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, it's a wild world out there. Be good to one another. Until next time, take care.